Hi, I'm Victor Gijsbers from Leiden University, and I'm going to talk about free will and the past. Although, to be honest, I'm mostly going to talk about the past and only a very little about free will at the beginning. This talk is based on an article that will soon appear in Tijdschrift voor Filosofie, and it's a pretty long article, so I'm going to have to just present the core argument to you, which has to do with a new version of presentism, causal presentism. But let me give you a brief indication how thinking about free will made me especially interested in this particular topic. So when I come to the discussion about free will, the problem I have is that the compatibilists seem obviously right, that it can't be the case that determinism or indeterminism matters to free will. On the other hand, the incompatibilists seem clearly right when they claim that real freedom requires an open future. But how is this possible? Because if I'm a compatibilist, I have to believe that determinism and free will are compatible, but if I'm an incompatibilist, or at least if I have this basic incompatibilist intuition, then I have to believe that free will requires an open universe, an open future. And how is it possible for determinism and an open future to be both true? That seems to be impossible, right? Determinism is something like the claim that if the past is given, then the future is given too, right? The future is determinate too, and nothing can change it. Now, I do think you can get around this, but getting around this requires us to get around that phrase, if the past is given. And I'm not going to go into exactly how I think that works. What I'm going to focus on is denying that the past is given. In other words, what I'm going to focus on is defending the position in the philosophy of time that is known as presentism. So according to presentism, the only thing that exists is the present. Right? And against this there would be eternalism, which claims that the past, the present and the future are all equally real. They have like the same ontological status. So presentism tells us that the past doesn't exist, or maybe it's better to say that the presentist tells us that to be is the same thing as to be present. And I think I would like to stress already here at the beginning that as a presentist, you're claiming that the past really doesn't exist, right? It's not the case that it's kind of out there, but with a slightly different status of existence. It just really doesn't exist, right? All that is the present. Now, to a certain extent, I would say that presentism seems a pretty common sense position, right? If you go to somebody and you say, hey, does Julius Caesar exist? They'll probably say no, which is precisely what presentism tells us. But there is also a famous problem for presentism. Maybe there are more. There's a lot of literature about presentism and the relativity theory, especially, well, both special and general relativity. But I'm not going to go into that in this talk. I'm interested in the other big problem for presentism, which is the problem of truths about the past. Because clearly we also believe that certain claims about the past are true. We claim that Julius Caesar did exist. We claim that Julius Caesar was for a while kind of the emperor of Rome, or at least the ruler of Rome. We claim that he was killed by Brutus and his co-conspirators, and so on and so forth. But how can those claims be true if the past doesn't exist? Right? What are they true of? What makes them true? So I would say that maybe the most important thing, maybe the most important problem that the presentist has to face is precisely this problem of the nature of past truths. And this is what a lot of the literature of presentism is about. So, before trying to introduce my own solution to this problem, let's look at a couple of well-known solutions that are on the books, that are being discussed in the present-day presentist literature. I have selected 3 of them. So the first is by John Bigelow. And John Bigelow tells us that in the present there are past referring properties. So, for instance, the ground on which the house which I'm in now has been built is like along the ancient borders of the Roman Empire. So perhaps let's assume that this ground has the property that it used to be walked on by Roman soldiers. Right? This ground right now has the property right now that it used to be walked on by Roman soldiers. And it's the fact that this ground has that like past referring property right now that makes it true to say Roman soldiers used to walk this ground. Right? Makes it true to make this claim about the past. So that's option 1, past referring properties. Here's a second option by Thomas Crisp. Thomas Crisp tells us, well, past times don't exist. Like, they don't exist concretely. They don't exist like the present exists. But they exist as abstract entities. Right? All the past moments of the universe exist as abstract entities, like outside of time. And when we make claims about the past, what makes them true are properties of those abstract entities. So claims about the past are made true not by the past, which doesn't exist, but by abstract times. Here is option 3 from Simon Keller. Simon Keller tells us this. He says, look, objects that no longer exist, right? So let's say Friedrich Nietzsche no longer exists. But, Keller says, there's something else that does exist, which is Friedrich Nietzsche's primitive thisness, his haecietas. And that haecietas has properties, like all the properties that Nietzsche ever had, somehow, still adhere or apply to that haecietas. And when we make statements about Friedrich Nietzsche, like we say Friedrich Nietzsche wrote The Antichrist, what makes it true is that this primitive thisness of Friedrich Nietzsche, which is still around, has a sort of equivalent property. Okay, so statements about the past are made true by the primitive thisnesses of past objects which are still around. So to be honest, when somebody comes to me with these 3 options and says, hey Victor, you want to defend presentism, pick your choice, I'm not happy. I believe that all of them are pretty far from anything I would like to say. And there are a couple of reasons for that. Right? One reason is that, well, I'm attracted to presentism because it, in a sense, seems to be a common sense position. Right? Only the present exists. Right? Julius Caesar doesn't exist. Yeah. But now, apparently, in order to make sense of my theory, I have to admit to the existence of past referring properties, abstract times, or primitive thisnesses that keep hanging around, and I'm starting to wonder whether I shouldn't just admit the existence of Julius Caesar. Like the common sense aspect, that which attracted me to the position in the first instance, seems to have sort of gone when we have to introduce this, well, kind of arcane metaphysics in order to make our theory work. So that is one worry. A second worry that I have is that, yeah, all these positions kind of are like presentist, if you look at the letter of the position. But are they really presentist in spirit? Right? I mean, there seems to be something eternalistic about the idea that the primitive thisnesses of past objects sort of keep a ghostly existence in the present. Well, I could equally well admit that the past still has some kind of ghostly existence. And there seems to be something eternalistic in the idea that there are these abstract times, not just as, like maybe ideas of abstract times or who knows what. I mean, it's a particular sequence of abstract times that corresponds to our actual past, that has this sort of special status and can make my claims true. That kind of is feels like a Platonist eternalism. Okay, so I mean, this is more of an intuitive claim maybe, but I worry that you're sort of giving in to eternalism by bringing in these metaphysical entities to save your presentism. Well, and finally, and maybe most importantly, and this is a point that has been made in the literature, I think very well, it is unclear how these entities could actually do their job. Right? Suppose that I say that the ground here has the past referring property Romans used to walk on it. This is supposed to sort of logically imply that Romans used to walk here. Right? The present existence of this past referring property is supposed to logically imply a statement about the past. But how does it do that? I mean, why couldn't these past referring properties be here and the past be totally different? I mean, by calling them past referring properties, you're kind of suggesting that they hang together in a certain way. But you have to explain how they can be past referring, right? They can't be past referring because they have some relation to the past, because they can't have a relation to the past if the past doesn't exist, right? They can't really refer to the past. So what is special about these properties that allows them to even imply something about the past? And the same question can be asked for these primitive distances and for these abstract times. Any claim we make about them seems to be logically compatible with every possible claim you could make about the past, including the claim that there is no past and that there's nothing true about the past. So it's really hard to see, even if we admit this metaphysics, how it's going to work. Okay, so here's the problem. Can we get, in a more efficient way and maybe a more common sense way, get to have the present make certain statements about the past true? Can we get true statements about the past from just the present? Well, I would like to say that there seems to be one relation that is a pretty obvious choice for this, right? If I ask people what connects the present to the past or what connects the present to the future, then the one thing that comes to mind is causation, right? The present causes the future and the present was caused by the past. That makes sense. In fact, even David Hume, not a gigantic friend of causation, tells us that all that we know about the past is through the relation of causation, right? It seems to play a really important role, connecting the present to the past and the future. So can't we use causal relations to understand the nature of the past and to get at truths about the past from the present alone? Well, here is M. Joshua Mazursky, who explains why, I guess, a lot of philosophers think that this couldn't work. He says the following: what exists in the present underdetermines what is true in the past. This seems impeccable. As Dummett writes, the state of the universe at any one instant is logically independent of its states at all other instants. We may think that, for example, one couldn't have a stomachache right now had one not eaten some improperly cooked food an hour ago, so that the present state of things isn't independent of the past. This is, however, to overlook that such dependencies are causal rather than logical or metaphysical. It is entirely possible to have a stomachache at tea and have eaten nothing an hour before. So here the idea is that causal relations aren't really necessary relations, right? I mean, it's possible to have something that is supposed to cause something else, and yet that not to happen, or that's supposed to have been caused by something else, and that never to have happened, which is basically a Humean view of causation. But if you're a presentist, then you can't really be a Humean, right? A Humean would generally, seem to believe that the world is just this four-dimensional mosaic of properties, and any causal relations are sort of, just patterns in the properties as they are spread out in time. But that's definitely not what a presentist believes, right? A presentist has to believe that the world is three-dimensional. Of course, a presentist also believes that the world is temporal. But what is the presentist saying? What does the presentist mean by saying that the world is temporal? Well, I would say that the temporist has to mean something like this. He has to mean something like whatever is happening. Right? The present is a moment of change. The present is a process. Something like that. There's something dynamic about the present. In particular, a presentist shouldn't claim that the present is moving from past to future. That is sort of totally self-defeating, trying to put presentism in the eternalist picture. No, what the presentist has to say is that the present is a moment of change. And that change is constitutive of time. It is what the temporal nature of the world amounts to. In other words, the presentist has to say something like, the future just is what the present is changing into. And the past just is what changed into the present. That is what the presentist has to say. That is the presentist conception of future and past. And now it's an open question whether it makes any sense to say that whatever the causal relations that there are, whatever the causal nature of the present is, the past could have been anything. No, maybe it couldn't have been anything, right? Maybe what we should say is that we have a present, it is a moment of change, it is full of causal powers, maybe laws of nature if that's what you like, you know, the kind of stuff that has implications about the past and the future. Given the causal powers that are here, given the laws of nature that are here, the future has to be a certain way. It has to unfold a certain way. The past has to have unfolded in a certain way. So we can describe the present in like thick causal terms in such a way that it logically implies things about the future and the past. Given that we think of the past and the future as that which gets implied by these causal laws. So let me say that again, because this is sort of the core of what I'm claiming here. Given that we have something like causal laws, then those causal laws and a description of the present is going to logically imply things. Well, is going to imply things at the very least, but if the laws are true, it's going to logically imply things about the past and the future. And that makes perfect sense, that makes perfect metaphysical sense, as long as we are willing to think of the future as whatever it is that gets logically implied by all the causal facts about the universe. And about the past as, you know, what gets backwards implied, or what gets implied if we, you know, take the reverse of the laws, of the causal laws that we have. So that's the way that I want to think of this. I want to think of the past as whatever, let me phrase it differently. I want to claim that some statement is true, some statement about the past is true, just in case you can logically infer it from a complete causal description of the present. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it fits a presentist metaphysics perfectly. So a truth about the past just is whatever you can logically infer from a full causal description, including causal powers and causal laws, of the present. And I like to think that saying this puts me in the tradition of the great, but in this context not much read philosopher, Collingwood. Here is what Collingwood says, and I'm going to give you a short R.G. Collingwood quotation. He says, "The present is composed in this way of two ideal elements, past and future. The present is the future of the past, and the past of the future. It is thus both future and past in a synthesis that is actual. The present is generally imagined as a mathematical point between the past and the future. But that is a false metaphor. For really it is not a point, but a world, a complex of events actually going on. And instead of its being a mere abstraction, a mathematical point between two real extensions, they, that is the present and the past, are mere abstractions, and it, as actuality, contains both past and future as ideal elements within itself. Alright, let me draw out one more conclusion from this before I close off my talk. What this implies is that if the present is ruled by indeterministic laws, or if the present is somehow not fully determinate, not fully defined, maybe because there is such a thing as free will, then the past is not going to be fully determinate, right? It's not going to be true about every statement of the past that it is either true or false. And the same holds for the future. It's not going to be the case for every statement about the future that it's either true or false. Now, about the future, people generally find that easy to accept, right? Having a sort of branching view of the future. But what I'm suggesting here is that we should also have a kind of branching view of the past. There is no unique past. At least if there's anything indeterminate or indeterministic about the present, there will be no unique past. And I think that's okay, right? We should stop being under the illusion that the past is like a kind of ghostly world behind us, fully determinate, like in a sense there, except that we can't see it. If you're a presentist, that is precisely what you shouldn't believe. Some statements about the past may be true, some may be false, but some may not have a truth value because the present implies nothing about them. And if that bothers you, maybe we should explore the analogy with mathematics, right? Something like the continuum hypothesis cannot be proven or disproven, and it makes a lot of sense to say that it does not have a truth value. And you only think that it has to have a truth value if you think of mathematics as a kind of ghostly realm of objects somewhere in Platonic heaven that we just unfortunately can't really see. Well, that's not the way we should think about mathematics, and it's also not the way we should think about the past. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.